In this tutorial, we're going to look at three parameters that you should plan for when you're planning a Flash project: the bit rate, the frame rate, and the frame size. The bit rate being measured in bits per second, or kilobits per second, or megabits per second, the frame rate in frames per second, and the frame size in pixels. By analogy, if you had a bucket brigade, the bit rate would be the number of gallons that are being transported per second, the frame rate the number of buckets that are being transported per second, and the frame size the size of the buckets. Let's take a look at the help file that discusses these parameters. Here we have a paragraph on the data rate or bit rate, and the main consideration here is just to make sure that you're keeping your bit rate low enough so that all your users can access your files without excessive weighting. On the frame rate, one of the questions you're asking yourself is, can I play this video back at the same rate that I recorded it at? If not, the best results usually come from dividing the original frame rate by a whole number in order to get the new playback frame rate. So for example, if you recorded at 30 frames per second, you could divide that by 2 and make your new playback rate 15 frames per second. Or divide it by 3 and make your new playback rate 10 frames per second. If you recorded at 24 frames per second, you might want to divide by 2 and get 12 frames per second. Or divide by 3 and play back at 8 frames per second. The frame size also has a determining effect on the data rate, because the larger your frame size, the higher your data rate is going to have to be in order for the video to look good. In addition, there's a relationship between the frame size and the frame aspect ratio. The aspect ratio being the ratio between the width and the height. So for example, 162 by 120 pixels is approximately 4 by 3. Same with 160 by 120 pixels. You want to make sure that your destination aspect ratio is the same as your source aspect ratio. So when you're encoding a QuickTime to FLV, for example, make sure that the aspect ratio of the FLV that you create is the same as the aspect ratio of the QuickTime. Otherwise you could get pillar boxing, for example. Let's take a look at that. This is pillar boxing. It occurred because the aspect ratio of the source file isn't the same as the aspect ratio of the destination. The source file is relatively less wide than the destination file. You may have seen letterboxing, where the source file is relatively wider than the destination file. You'll see this on TV because the aspect ratio of a movie has more width than the aspect ratio of a TV set. It's sometimes unavoidable on a TV set if you want to show the whole movie, but on the web it's never unavoidable, and so you always want to keep the aspect ratio of the source and the destination the same. Let's take a look at these parameters in the Adobe Media Encoder. Here we have the frame size, 320 by 240, the frame rate, 10 frames per second, and here we have the bit rate, the data rate, 1500 bits per second. And down here we can determine these things. We can set them. So for example, here we can resize the video, set the frame size. Here we can set the frame rate. And down here we can set the bit rate. And that concludes this tutorial on the bit rate, frame rate, and frame size.